The incredible story of Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, began with the fact that in his youth, most of his neighbors in California in the 1970s were geniuses and invented all sorts of super clever devices. Meanwhile, Jobs dropped out of college, collected bottles for money, ate for free in a Krishna temple, took drugs, meditated, searched for enlightenment and the meaning of life. Jobs had a friend named Steve Wozniak, a super botanist and electronics genius who could assemble a computer using half the number of microchips than usual, as if he were a magician and wizard. At that time, computers were only sold as sets of microchips that needed to be assembled and soldered by hand. One day, Wozniak came up with the idea of creating a complete system unit that would be all in one box. When the invention was ready, Jobs was amazed by what he saw. Pressing keys on the screen immediately produced letters. He decided that this amazing invention should bring them income and said, "Even if we fail, we will have our own company, and at least once in our lives, we will find out what it is." Jobs named their new company Apple Computer. The word Apple seemed as familiar as a piece of cake. It attracted people and softened the seriousness of computer. They talked about their invention in a home computer club. Their performance did not make much of an impression, but one person became interested. The owner of a computer store needed goods for sale and placed an order for 50 computers. To fulfill this order, they had to purchase parts for as much as $15,000, which they didn't have. Therefore, Jobs scoured the entire Silicon Valley in search of these funds. Whenever he mentioned a computer intended for ordinary people, all bankers reacted as if he had spat on their shoes. All he could find was a loan that had to be repaid within 30 days. Therefore, work was in full swing. Computers were assembled right at Jobs' home. They attracted all their friends. The bedroom, kitchen table, and garage turned into workspaces. Jobs managed to get a huge discount on the parts, so they produced twice as many computers as planned. 50 were sold to the store owner, and the remaining 50 were sold to friends. The business took off, and they produced another 100 computers and offered them to electronics stores at triple the cost. But their competitors were not idle. In 1976, computer stores began to appear like mushrooms after rain. There were models that were much more presentable and solid, while their Apple I model looked like a sloppy wooden box. Jobs realized that in order to reach a new level, the product had to be sold not only assembled, but fully equipped, so that customers would not have to buy a monitor, keyboard, casing, and power supply separately. He wanted not only hackers who build computers themselves, but also thousands of ordinary people to become buyers. In those days, computers looked like bulky, gray metal boxes that sounded like tractors. That's why Jobs designed his own casing made of white plastic with streamlined edges to stand out among the bleak competitors. Engineers developed an innovative power supply unit that could work without a rattling fan. Wozniak came up with a brilliant way to display color images on the screen. But all these fancy innovations required significant investments in production. Jobs went to various companies, but he was turned down everywhere. "We don't need you! You haven't even finished college!" Jobs looked shocking. A stinking hippie in sandals with a terrible hairstyle and audacity that made people cringe. But Jobs didn't give up and made his way to the guru of Silicon Valley startup investment, Don Valentine. But he also considered Jobs a marketing failure of the highest order, because Jobs himself personally went to stores and offered his products. So Valentine flatly refused to deal with such a loser. However, Jobs forced him to advise him on something, and Valentine sent him to marketer Mike Markkula, who, at the age of 33, was already making money by the shovel and was fabulously rich. No one understood pricing, sales systems, and marketing better than him. When Markkula saw Jobs' computer, his eyes almost popped out of his head. The Apple II impressed him so much that he decided to overlook the shabby appearance of both Steves. After all, it's never too late to meet scissors. Markkula painted rosy prospects, convinced that Apple would become a multi-billion-dollar business, and offered $250,000 in exchange for a third of the shares. In the end, everyone got a 26% stake, leaving the rest for potential investors. On January 3, 1977, the new corporation, Apple Computer Company, was officially registered. Markkula taught the youngsters about common sense, saying that in order to succeed, You don't need to strive to get rich, you just need to do what you believe in. People judge primarily by the cover. You can create a first-class product, but it's useless if you present it carelessly. Jobs absorbed it like a sponge. And at the first exhibition in 1977, he positioned himself right in the center of the hall to loudly announce his super genius computer. To stand out among the rest and astonish the audience, Jobs covered the stand with velvet and made striking lighting. He even dressed decently for the first time in his life. The brilliant beige case of the Apple II looked solid, accessible, and simple, unlike the frightening metal boxes of competitors. For the first time, people came to Jobs themselves, not the other way around. At this exhibition, he even received an order for 300 computers. Apple finally became a real company with a dozen employees. The team moved from the garage to an office in Cupertino. However, the new responsibilities were difficult for Jobs. He became increasingly rude and despotic every day. He could approach any of his employees and say that they were doing complete crap. Markkula couldn't stand these scandals, and in order to rein in the ever-excited Jobs, he hired President Michael Scott, whose sole task was to tame Jobs. But for Jobs, handing over leadership to someone else was like death. He didn't recognize anyone's authority, and this inevitably led to more conflicts. Jobs threw tantrums, causing thunder and lightning over any slightest pretext, and often reduced himself to tears. Nevertheless, Apple thrived. The disgustingly stinking Jobs, like a rotting bum, made zero impression on investors, but as soon as they poked the Apple II, they immediately invested money. On December 12, 1980, Apple went public with shares priced at $22 each. Within 1 hour, 4.6 million shares were sold, making Apple the most successful company in the history of the stock market. At 25 years old, Jobs became fabulously wealthy with a fortune of $256 million. There were not many competitors, and thanks to the Apple II model, sales skyrocketed from 2,500 in 1977 to 210,000 in 1981. But Jobs wanted to leave a mark on the universe. He hoped that the Apple III model would do that with more memory, a larger screen, and an industrial design. However, due to the high demand for computers, Apple drowned in its own fat, stopped noticing its own mistakes, and became a bloated, bureaucratic entity. The department working on the Apple III was like a revolving door. Moreover, Jobs rudely intervened in the project every time. His abnormal drive for perfection made the case almost microscopic, so the board had excessive component density and poor connectors that often failed. Therefore, the release of the Apple III in May 1980 was a complete failure, and when the machine was finally finished, it was too late, and the company's reputation had fallen below the floor. Meanwhile, IBM's computer sales soared to first place. The mistakes were blamed on the engineers, and Jobs washed his hands and stepped down, thinking about how to create something completely different. At that time, all of America was crazy about VHS videotapes, with almost every family wanting to buy them, while computers were seen as something super incomprehensible. DOS queries were used in computers, which were difficult to understand. Therefore, it had to be the eighth wonder of the world for computers to become as popular as VHS tapes. However, at the Xerox PARC Research Center, they were already working on a similar wonder. A super simple computer that even a heavily drunk novice could understand. Instead of DOS queries, they came up with using graphics, a desktop with documents and folders that magically opened with a click of a mouse. At the time, this seemed like magic. This project was strictly classified. But in 1979, Xerox was eager to invest in Apple. Jobs agreed on the condition that they would reveal all their secrets. Xerox believed that these upstarts did not have the intellectual capacity to understand their super genius invention, so they agreed. When Jobs went to Xerox to learn about the new wonder technology, Xerox decided to deceive him and didn't show him everything. Jobs demanded to see more, but each time they showed him something else, some other insignificant programs, to divert attention from the main secret. Jobs realized this, understood that he was being fooled, and said, "Enough of this nonsense." He called the head of Xerox's venture investment department and complained. And when Jobs' team finally saw the invention in full, they were amazed. Engineer Bill Atkinson stared at each pixel, almost diving into the screen with his head. Jobs was jumping around the computer, waving his hands excitedly and shouting, "This is a gold mine!" It was as if a veil had been lifted from Jobs' eyes. He was stunned, and finally understood what the future of computers should be like. Xerox received the promised 100,000 shares of Apple. The price of these shares was $1 million, but from the outside it looked as if the Tatar-Mongol horde had robbed defenseless peasants. However, one idea is not enough. The main thing is the embodiment, and Jobs did it splendidly. They made the mouse more elegant and comfortable. They made the body as simple as a toaster. Engineers significantly reduced the area of the body by stuffing the system under the screen. They improved the interface and added smoothness to the commands. The computer was named Macintosh. While they were dealing with all of this, in August 1981, IBM released its computer. Jobs believed that if he lost this battle, the computer industry would plunge into a dark Middle Ages for 20 years. He liked to think of himself as a rebel against the empire of evil, and IBM was well suited for that role. Jobs believed that fate had given him the greatest mission to save the planet. But to save the planet, a good president was needed who had weight on Wall Street. In 1983, Jobs realized that he was not yet mature enough for such a position, as he became overly excited at any slightest reason. Therefore, the board of directors threw the fishing line to the main advertising magician of that time, John Scully of PepsiCo. But he flatly refused. And then Jobs lured him, saying the killer phrase that went down in history: "Will you keep selling sugar water for the rest of your life, or will you come with me and change the world?" The new miracle Apple operating system worked only on native hardware. Jobs believed that full incompatibility with other computers was a brilliant solution. However, at that time, the then unknown Bill Gates was writing programs for Apple. He saw in the Mac this miracle interface with stunning graphics, quickly realizing that this miracle had a future. And in 1983, at a lavish conference, he solemnly announced that Microsoft was developing Windows with a graphical interface exactly like Apple's. Upon learning of this, Jobs flew into a rage and accused Gates of shameless theft. However, Gates gave a witty response that went down in history. "I went to our mutual neighbor Xerox to steal a TV and found that you beat me to it." Meanwhile, the evil empire outpaced Apple. IBM sold 3 times as many computers, and their market share grew by 26%. So all hope was placed on the Macintosh. When planning the launch of the Mac, Jobs wanted people to be amazed. And in 1984, the Apple team, together with director Ridley Scott, created a commercial in which Apple, as a chosen messiah, rose up against the forces of darkness. The commercial showed how, in a gray world of propaganda, the main character, dressed in bright clothing, represented the Macintosh and symbolized revolution with her rebellious actions. The science fiction-style commercial hinted at the total domination of IBM and George Orwell's prophecy. IBM represented the evil empire, and Apple was the rebel alliance that liberated people from oblivion. However, the Apple board of directors was disgusted by the commercial, which cost $750,000. They believed it was the worst advertising they had ever seen. But there was no turning back. Airtime had already been purchased during the Super Bowl, a time when half the population of the United States gathers in front of their screens. Every second of airtime was worth its weight in gold. 30 seconds cost $5.2 million. As a result, the entire country watched as a menacing crowd marched to ominous music. The daring, unsettling, and mysterious commercial, unlike any other, was viewed by 96 million people. That evening, all television channels were buzzing about it. The commercial had the effect of a bomb exploding because at that time, most young people believed that computers were tools of power that turned people into obedient robots, and the advertisement captured the spirit of revolution. The commercial suggested that Apple was opposing the sinister plan of large corporations to enslave the world and people's minds. The commercial resonated well with the mood of Americans, as at that time the Cold War with the Soviet totalitarian regime was raging, which President Reagan called the evil empire. The first 100 days saw Mac sell like hotcakes. But when the wave of excitement subsided and the illusion was shattered, it turned out that it wasn't such a juicy steak after all. sales plummeted. Mac turned out to be terribly slow, and no amount of advertising could help. The pretty picture came at a cost. More power was required. Macintosh had too little memory, no built-in hard drive, and the lack of a fan led to frequent crashes. When customers realized all of this, sales dropped. Jobs believed that everything he touched turned to gold, and so he didn't conduct any test trials. Mac lacked programs, had no expansion slots, and a small screen. The computer spit out disks for the slightest reason and demanded something from the user. Meanwhile, IBM supported 1,000 programs. Due to Jobs' endless edits, the price of Macintosh rose to $1,995. Jobs witnessed a horrifying sight. Salespeople in stores first showed customers IBM, and those who wanted Mac were still redirected to IBM. Therefore, sales were close to zero. Jobs was burdened by this situation. Engineers fell into depression. For several months, they couldn't do anything. Many talented people left the company, but the main news was the departure of veteran Wozniak. He believed it was the height of stupidity to underestimate the Apple II model, which still brought the company the majority of its income. The warehouses were overflowing with a huge stockpile of unsold computers. Apple was in a panic and was sinking like the Titanic. In many ways, the culprit was Jobs himself. He made a computer for organizations, but advertised it to regular people. If Jobs hadn't been in such a rush, the picture might have been different, but he always felt that his life was short, and therefore he needed to hurry to accomplish everything. Jobs was supposed to control Scully, but Jobs was quite the puppet master. He charmed Scully so much that he lost his head and began to think of himself as special. The more Jobs manipulated him, the more he despised him. The disagreements increasingly worried the board of directors. Jobs' mood swings became sharper. He could humiliate and trample anyone he met in the hallway. Subordinates saw the company as a rudderless boat adrift in the fog. In the end, Scully removed Jobs from the Macintosh project. Jobs decided not to give up so easily and began to plot a coup, trying to lure people to his side. However, Scully found out about this, and at a board meeting, he laid down a harsh ultimatum: either he or Jobs. Everyone voted for Scully. Jobs was knocked out and trampled to dust. However, many employees were unhappy with Jobs' dismissal. The company was no longer suitable for creativity, and they left with Jobs. When the board members found out about this, they reacted extremely harshly. Many were furious. They decided that Jobs had fooled them. The members were stunned by Jobs' treacherous act, secretly plotting to take away the most valuable employees from right under their noses. All traitors were unceremoniously expelled from the company's premises, and Jobs was sued. After that, Apple's shares rose by 7% because shareholders were glad that the Californian layabout was no longer in charge. Steve was knocked down, but not destroyed, and he was not going to fade away. One day, while wandering around universities, Jobs met a biochemist who was depressed and frustrated that without a powerful computer, it took them a whole week just to run one experiment. Hearing this, Jobs was inspired with the idea of producing powerful computers for universities and founded a new company called Next. Jobs wanted to make a computer in the form of an ideal black cube. The cube represented solidity. Imitating the Japanese, Jobs built an expensive robotic factory, so money flew out of his own pocket like water through a sieve. In September 1986, everything went wrong. Jobs had not learned anything. There were $20,000 chairs in the factory, and the company was threatened with bankruptcy. To raise more money, Jobs put 10% of the shares up for sale for $3 million, a sum he had pulled out of thin air. The company had achieved nothing up to that point, neither products nor revenue. Therefore, no investor was in a hurry to invest money. Yet Jobs drew the attention of one man, Texan Ross Perot, who was inspired by Jobs' ideas and called him, saying, "If you need money, just whistle." Perhaps more than anything else in his life, Perot regretted not investing in Microsoft when Bill Gates, still a very young suckling, begged him for money. This time, Perot was determined not to repeat his mistakes and invested $20 million for a 16% stake. In addition to money, Perot brought credibility to Next in the eyes of others. Wherever he was, he praised Jobs to everyone. Bill Gates, on the other hand, was of a different opinion. He called Jobs' machine junk with an idiotic case and the project doomed to fail. In October 1988, Jobs gave a brilliant presentation of Next, which caused a storm of enthusiasm. But the interest quickly faded, and his computer was quickly forgotten. And when the computer finally hit the market in 1989, sales did not exceed a measly 400 units per month. There were not enough compatible programs for Next, and there were cheaper analogs on the market. The expensive factory stood idle, and the company was losing money. Jobs was derisively called a one-time wonder because he had nothing but failures except for the Apple II model. One design was not enough to sell a computer well. The holy empire of Jobs was crumbling, while Microsoft was growing rapidly, becoming the center of the tech industry. In 1994, Apple sales also fell below the floor. Since they kicked out Jobs, their innovative drive has completely dwindled. Meanwhile, Microsoft was reaping the rewards of successfully copying the idea. In 1995, Windows became the most successful operating system of all time, while Macintosh profits were on the brink of disaster. Watching as Microsoft swiftly absorbed market share and Windows computers swept off shelves, Apple executives deviated from Jobs' principle and allowed the license to sell the Macintosh OS to other manufacturers. However, this further exacerbated the situation, and computer sales plummeted to unreachable lows. Management believed that the only way to save the company was to sell it to someone else. But no one wanted to buy a lame horse that was already 1 foot in the grave. Jobs could have swallowed up Apple and become the head of his brainchild again. But he did not want a hostile takeover. He wanted them to invite him back. They showed interest in his operating system. This was the plan to enslave Jobs. Apple buys his company, and this gives him the right to enter the board of directors, and from there to reach the position of CEO. And Apple fell for it. In 1996, they bought Next for $426 million. Bill Gates, learning about this, was beside himself with anger. He believed that the bearded shaman had duped Apple and sold them unnecessary junk. At first, in 1997, Jobs did not interfere much in the company's affairs and was at Apple as an unofficial consultant. They only used him for show. But gradually, he began to put his people in key positions. Meanwhile, under the old management, Apple barely moved, and sales plummeted at full speed. At some point, Jobs was finally invited to take on the position of CEO, but Jobs declined, yet he still had real power. The head of Apple at the time was Ed Woolard. Even he was thinking of leaving against the backdrop of the company's catastrophic situation. In 1997, the turnover of personnel flowed like a river, and to stop it, Jobs finally decided to intervene in the management's affairs and review employee stock options prices. But the directors stood up like raging horses. Then Jobs said that otherwise, he would leave the company and never return, as he did not have time to fool around with the board, and demanded that everyone resign. Only then would he return. Only Woolard could stay. The force was on Jobs' side. In the current situation, many even wanted to leave themselves. Even Father Markkula wound up his fishing gear. Jobs finally took on the position of CEO. By this time, Jobs had gained wisdom and maturity. As soon as he gained power, he immediately banned the sale of licenses for the Macintosh OS and began to destroy the proliferating clones. Jobs believed that it was the most idiotic thing in the world to allow manufacturers of shoddy computers to use his super OS and grab a piece of the profit with their dirty tentacles. The company churned out countless variations of each product model like pancakes. It was pure madness. Tons of completely unnecessary products. Even the employees themselves no longer understood what they were doing. Jobs reduced the range by 70%. Jobs' ability to focus saved Apple. In the first year alone, he fired more than 3,000 employees. After 2 years of staggering losses, when bankruptcy was just around the corner, Apple finally squeezed out a profit. The news of Jobs' return to the helm raised Apple's shares from $13 to $20. At the Macworld Conference in Boston in August 1997, loyal Apple fans greeted Jobs like a rock star. In his speech, Jobs unexpectedly announced a partnership with Microsoft, which would invest $150 million in Apple. Bitter enemies suddenly joined forces. By that time, Microsoft was already king of the hill in the market, so Jobs needed Gates's friendship to buy time and climb out of the abyss. On this news, the shares skyrocketed, adding $830 million to the company's value in just one day. Apple was 1 foot in the grave and suddenly came back to life. In the computer industry, all manufacturers were creating identical gray boxes, outsourcing production, and competing only on price. Jobs believed that a revolutionary device should look the part. In most companies, designers danced to the tune of manufacturers, but Jobs did the opposite. First design, and engineers adjust to the casing. So in '98, the crazy and futuristic iMac appeared with a transparent case made of turquoise plastic resembling a giant drop. At that time, this computer looked like it was teleported from the future. Instead of pale boxes, separate monitors, and a pile of wires, an exceptionally elegant device was presented. In those days, people were afraid and avoided technology, but iMac owners placed it in the most prominent place in their homes to make their guests envious. People rushed to buy the computers off the shelves. By the end of the year, 800,000 units had been sold. Bill Gates assured everyone that this success was temporary. Jobs was outraged that his super innovative computers were placed on shelves in stores alongside disgusting junk like Dell, and the salespeople didn't even bother explaining the differences, and these stores were located in God knows where. That's why Jobs decided to build his own stores. He personally designed every tiny detail of the interior in a minimalist style. Analysts unanimously predicted failure. The board of directors was also not thrilled with Jobs' crazy new idea. Many companies went bankrupt when they opened their own chain. It seemed like madness. However, by 2004, more than 5,000 people a week were visiting Apple stores, and profits reached $1.2 billion, an absolute record for retail. When a new store opened, visitors camped out at the doors to be the first inside. But the problem with the stores paled in comparison to the ominous darkness that loomed over the digital world in 2001. In the 90s, the word Internet sounded like a magical spell, and investors went crazy, pouring money into dot-coms. But the bloated dot-com bubble burst, and the NASDAQ index plummeted almost 50%. So everyone said that the computer era was over, but Jobs believed it was only to their advantage. While competitors tightened their belts, Apple continued to innovate and turn the computer into a digital hub, the heart of all other gadgets, which it managed and synchronized. Now, it was a piece of cake to plug in a camera and download videos to the disk, and with the iMovie program, even a senile pensioner could easily edit a cool blockbuster with special effects and music. However, syncing with music was a headache for Apple. In 2000, everyone went crazy copying music onto computers and creating their own compilations on disks. That year, around 320 million blank CDs were sold in the United States. But at that time, all the programs were extremely inconvenient and complicated. In 2001, Jobs created iTunes, a program for burning CDs as part of that very same heart. But that wasn't enough. iTunes needed to connect well with music players. But at the time, all the players were complete crap, as if they were made in hell. They were impossible to use and could only hold a measly 16 songs. And since Jobs loved listening to music, he decided to make his own player. The player was put together in just 1 year. Such an unbelievably fast period was achieved because Jobs waved his whip in front of his employees like a prison warden before his inmates. He believed that if you want a super team, you have to be ruthless. The weak attract the weak. Jobs' toughness paid off. Dozens of offended employees ended their pathetic stories by admitting that Jobs had achieved from them what they couldn't even dream of. Jobs knew how to brainwash and infect the team with the desire and confidence that they could achieve the impossible. And people did the impossible because they didn't know that it was impossible. That's how the iPod with a coin-sized hard drive that held 1,000 songs and ran for 10 hours without recharging was born. You could get to any track with just 3 touches. Compared to the iPod, all other players looked like they were made in Uzbekistan. But the public was skeptical of the iPod with its sky-high price of $399 in 2001. Online jokes circulated that the iPod stood for idiots paid over the odds. Nevertheless, soon after, sales skyrocketed. Every quarter, you could see someone with white earphones. Following the success of the iPod, iMac computer sales were also boosted. So Jobs spent even more money on advertising the iPod, an astronomical $75 million. This was 100 times more than the competitors were spending, and with this, he dominated the entire market. But in 2002, the music industry faced a new problem. To upload music onto the iPod, it was necessary to download it from the internet, which was inundated with pirate services at the time. Piracy had everyone on edge. The Wild West reigned supreme. Recording companies were scrambling to find a way to protect their content. And it wasn't just them who suffered. People who downloaded free music were plagued with viruses and terrible quality. Jobs realized that the best way to combat theft was to create an alternative, as 80% of people who stole music simply had no other choice. So Jobs created the online music store iTunes Store and convinced leading recording companies to allow him to sell music there. Not entire albums, but individual songs, each for 99 cents. Because usually there are only 3 good tracks in an album, the rest is dull garbage. Many musicians' contracts prohibited them from selling music individually, so Jobs had to personally persuade some of them. When Jobs showed Dr. Dre the interaction between the iPod and the iTunes Store, he exclaimed, "Dude, finally someone did it." At the time of its launch in 2003, the store had 200,000 songs. In the first 6 days, a whole million works were sold. But many people couldn't use the iTunes Store because it didn't work on Windows. No one could have thought that one day this day would come, but in 2003, Apple made a version of iTunes for its sworn enemy, Windows. Journalists asked Jobs what it was like to develop a program for Windows. Jobs replied, "It's like handing a glass of ice water to someone in hell." By 2004, Apple had established a dominant position in the player market. If before, to attract a celebrity to an advertisement, it was necessary to pay them an astronomical sum, now musicians themselves dreamed of appearing in an iPod ad, as it guaranteed them overwhelming success. For example, the long-forgotten Bob Dylan advertised the iPod in his music video, and in the very first week, he took first place in the Billboard chart. iTunes could literally catapult anyone to the pedestal of fame. Sales of iPod were impressive. In 2004, they sold 5 million units. In 2005, they sold 20 million. But unexpectedly, phones with built-in music players began appearing all over the world. This meant only one thing: iPod would soon become obsolete. Video cameras were already selling poorly because of this. Jobs realized that if they didn't create a phone, they would be left with nothing. He noticed one oddity. All the phones on the market at the time were ugly as sin, and figuring them out was a headache. This widespread stupidity inspired him to create a truly user-friendly phone. Additionally, at that time, the phone market was growing not by days but by hours. Jobs understood that if a super product emerged among the gray dreck, it would have the same stunning success as the iPod did. In 2004, Apple employees began noticing how their colleagues mysteriously disappeared from the office and never returned. Nobody could explain where they went. Jobs recruited people for a secret laboratory to create an epic device. The engineers considered themselves elite and hardly ever left the lab. They ate, showered, slept, celebrated holidays, and worked in the same place. Touchscreens had already been invented, but they all worked with a stylus. Jobs believed that if you offered a stylus, you were done for, so his elite engineers created a stylus-free touch sensor. As a result, the picture could be moved with a flick of the finger. At the time, this seemed like magic. Keyboard buttons took up a lot of screen space, so the elite engineers made them virtual. They only appeared when they were needed. As a result, the screen occupied all the space right up to the edges, with only a thin rim around it. The result was the iPhone, which combined 3 devices: a music player, computer, and phone. When the iPhone went on sale in 2007, competitors thought it was too expensive at $500. Business people won't use a phone without a keyboard, they thought. But by the end of 2010, Apple had sold 90 million iPhones, and the company had taken over more than half of the global mobile phone market's profits. Fans called the iPhone the Jesus phone. Now, thanks to this universal device, Apple's budget is larger than even the U.S. Department of the Treasury. On October 5, 2011, the day after the presentation of the iPhone 4S, Steve Jobs passed away at the age of 56. Unprecedented mourning enveloped the entire planet. All stores turned into temples. When Jobs discovered a tumor in his pancreas, he tried to treat it with all kinds of herbs and roots for a long time. Therefore, the cancer had spread to other organs, and doctors were powerless. It is rare to come across a 40-year-old innovator, but Jobs' fortunes turned up just as he turned 40. Jobs proved that even after 40, a person can remain inspired. He always wondered why those over 30 began to think in narrow patterns and stopped following progress. People are like a needle stuck in a worn-out record, getting stuck in these patterns, and then they cannot free themselves from them and stagnate. It is extremely rare for a person not to lose interest in life and to maintain childlike curiosity until death. Jobs glorified crazies and rebels, all those who think differently, unconventionally. Somehow, Jobs' marketing made people believe that they were free, creative, progressive rebels just because they use Apple. In this brand positioning, Jobs was inspired by Nike's approach, which was the first to praise not the product itself, but those who use it. Thank you so much for watching this video and for joining us on this journey of exploration and learning. We hope that you found it informative and enjoyable. If you have any suggestions for future videos or topics you'd like to see us cover, please let us know. We are always looking for new ideas and ways to improve our content. Thank you again for your support, and we look forward to seeing you in our next video.